Yes, Sue, it's some 12 years since Formula One has had to come to terms with a driver fatality, but that doesn't make it any easier to come to terms with the death yesterday of the very popular Austrian Roland Ratzenberger. Jonathan Palmer, how do you gauge the mood around Imola today?
Well, I think on the face of it, it's sort of business as usual, but of course, you don't have to go very far beneath the skin to realise it's put a massive dampener on the weekend. Formula One, though, of course, is a very professional operation. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with the circuit or any of the safety standards around, and it's only appropriate that the meeting carries on, and indeed Ratzenberger would have wanted that himself. But I think it's important that does happen, it does go on, and it's one of these situations in which either people pack up and go home, or they just refocus, commit themselves to what they're doing, and get on with it, and that's what's happening.
They're certainly not packing up and going home, they're all leaving the pit lane right at this moment. But the drivers have had to make a lot of adaptations, given the new rule changes. Well, that have played a part in what happened, not only for Roland, but also in the violent accident with Barrichello on Friday.
I really don't think the current regulations have done anything to contribute towards these incidents. I think that both the ones that we've seen with Barrichello and Ratzenberger, there's no evidence that they are due to the new regulations, which undoubtedly make the cars harder to drive. So I don't think we've got anything to fear on that count.
Roland Ratzenberger's team, Simtech, remain in the lineup today, and David Brabham will drive. That surprised a few people, I think.
Yes, I think perhaps it has, but the team are very confident that there is nothing wrong with the car in terms of its design or its construction. They're confident that no mistake was made in terms of its assembly, and therefore I think they feel that it's the right thing to do to carry on a race. David Brabham has taken the very courageous decision to race in these circumstances, and of course we all wish them the very best for this difficult race for them.
The car's heading for the grid and a very good racing prospect, isn't it?
Oh, I think we have. I think getting back to the front, we've got the season's favourite Senna, who's certainly struggling with 0 points. Schumacher has won the first two. These two are really locked together. It's a real needle match, and today's going to be a very important race for Senna.
Jonathan, thanks. We'll hear from you a little more a bit later.
Very much. Thank you indeed.
And yes, here at Imola, the grid will be forming in the next few minutes for the start of the San Marino Grand Prix, which is scheduled for 1 o'clock UK time, 2 o'clock local time. It's warm, weather conditions and track conditions are ideal. And there's no disguising the fact that after 2 non-finishes, today is the day that Ayrton Senna really must make his first move in this 1994 World Championship. Imola is known as an out-and-out power circuit, which certainly suits the Williams-Renaults a little more than it might suit Michael Schumacher's Benetton Ford. And Ayrton Senna has duly taken pole position, the 65th pole position of his career, but Schumacher, 2 wins out of 2, is right alongside him on the front row. The Ferrari of Gerhard Berger qualifying on the second row, that's put a few thousand more on the gate here at Imola. Damon Hill alongside Berger, Damon with continuing frustrations, some way off the pace of his teammate Senna, but at least Damon's got points on the board. Ayrton Senna must open his account today. The start to the season couldn't have been worse for Ayrton Senna. First of all, spinning out of his home Grand Prix in Brazil. That was in pursuit of a dominant first-round winner, Michael Schumacher. And in the Pacific Grand Prix at... The San Marino Grand Prix weekend had begun with the dramatic accident that Rubens Barrichello miraculously survived, with only minor injuries. But the next day, the miracles ran out, and Roland Ratzenberger, in only his second Grand Prix, became the first race-meeting fatality that Formula One had suffered in 12 years. The next was tragically barely 24 hours away. And race day today had other potential tragedies. At the start, Pedro Lamy in the Lotus failed to avoid a stalled JJ Leto. A tyre flew into the crowd, injuring 8 spectators, none seriously. Both drivers were unhurt. Later in the afternoon, a tyre and bodywork flew off Michele Alboretto's Minardi as it sped out of the pit lane. 4 mechanics, 2 from Ferrari, 2 from Lotus, needed hospital treatment. So it's been a dreadful day, and the loss of Ayrton Senna is really tough to comprehend. He qualified yesterday with his 65th pole position of his career. If he'd gone on to take the victory that everyone predicted, it would have been his 42nd in Grand Prix motor racing. He was 3 times a winner here at San Marino. He was 3 times a world champion. Here's the thoughts of our commentary team. Murray Walker, an overwhelming sense of sadness here today. What kind of talent, what kind of star? has the sport lost today?
Well, I can still hardly comprehend that it's happened, Steve. I remember Ayrton Senna, and it seems terrible to have to use those words, as a tremendously intense man who was determined to achieve his goals. He came here as an unknown Brazilian who couldn't speak English. He came to a cold climate. He lived a long way away from home, but he applied himself 1000% to his craft. He succeeded in all the categories that he was in until he got to Formula One. He very nearly won a Grand Prix in his first year. He then went on to become a 3-time world champion. And as far as I'm concerned, and I do see all of them, he was a man who was always courteous, always considerate, always helpful, and he was a man of his word. If you wanted to talk to him, he would say, yes, come and see me after qualifying, and you might have to wait a long time, but you always got him. On top of that, he was a tremendously successful businessman. He was much loved by his family and all his friends around him. And it is a truly dreadful, dreadful blow to motorsport.
You've seen most of the great Grand Prix drivers there have been. Where would you place Ayrton Senna among those?
Oh, I would unhesitatingly place him in the top 3. I think I would place him with Nuvolari and with Jim Clark, and I would put Sterling Moss in the same bracket. But you can't speak about many drivers in the same breath as you can Ayrton Senna.
How does the sport now handle a loss, if it can? Formula One has an image problem now?
Well, what I'm going to say, Steve, may sound callous, and I don't mean it to, but Grand Prix racing, motor racing, is an extremely dangerous sport. It always has been, it always will be. It's in the nature of the sport. The drivers who take part in it know that something like this, in their heart of hearts, could happen to them. They wouldn't do it if they knew it was going to happen to them, but they accept the risks because the passion is worth the risk, and that's what they want to do, and I don't think anything ought to be done to stop them. It's happened in the past, it will happen again. All I can say is that it has happened on this occasion to a truly great man, and although it's a cliche, he will be desperately, desperately missed, and Formula One is going to be stunned for the whole of the rest of this season.
Jonathan Palmer, amid all the great sadness, the sport has to ask itself, why have there been 2 fatalities in just 2 days? There must be a reason.
That's certainly a logical question, but I can't help thinking that it is the most tragic of coincidence overall. I think it's important to recognise that from what we know, neither of these 2 accidents had anything to do with drivers wrestling with their cars, trying to overdrive it and losing control purely through trying to go quickly. I think in both situations, in both circumstances, something has broken, possibly with the car, possibly some debris on the circuit, possibly a tyre. There has been some outside influence rendering the driver no chance of controlling the vehicle, and with the very high speeds that we see here at Imola, plus the fact that those high speeds are seen on swerving parts of the circuit, the car will almost certainly go off the road and hit the concrete walls on either side.
But we talked before the race, with the change in regulations, there are new and greater demands on drivers this year.
Yes, there are. We've seen changes in regulations removing active suspension, which only had 1 year of prevalence in Formula One after all. You know, we've been using the sorts of suspension that we have now for decades in the past. So non-active suspension is not new. And indeed, nor is getting rid of traction control. Traction control is undoubtedly an aid to safety, in the same way that ABS braking is an aid to safety under braking. But of course, it does remove driver influence, and it's always been very important to Formula One to have the driver being in as much control of the car as possible, and his skills influencing the car's performance. But again, those kind of changes, particularly removing traction control, sure has meant the cars have been harder to drive, but really at the slower parts of the circuit, it's easier to spin the cars. But once again, I emphasize that these 2 incidents had nothing to do with drivers losing control of their vehicles while pushing them to the limit. In both circumstances, the cars left the road when they should have been capable of rounding the corners without any problem whatsoever, well within the limits of both the drivers and the cars. Something went wrong in both occasions.
You raced against Ayrton Senna. What a great talent the sport has lost today.
It's absolutely devastating. I think everybody is totally numb about the thing. To my mind, he was the best driver Grand Prix racing had ever seen. Different people have different views, but I think the the guy was quite exceptional and is a dreadful loss to the world of motorsport.
There'll be more on a great racing driver in a special tribute programme at 2:20 on Wednesday afternoon, BBC Two. We had a race today, two-part race in which Michael Schumacher made it 3 wins out of 3 for Benetton. Nicola Larini added some joy to the day with second place for Ferrari, Hakkinen third for McLaren, with Damon Hill completing the top 6. Schumacher now dominates the World Championship with maximum points from the first 3 rounds. The next round in Monaco in 2 weeks' time takes place without one of Monaco's most famous residents, Ayrton Senna. As a result, there was no champagne on the podium after the race this afternoon. There really was nothing to celebrate, even for Michael Schumacher.
Just win the race, but I can't feel satisfied, can't feel happy. I mean, what happened this weekend, never have seen something like this. Not just one thing, so many things. The only thing I can say about this is I hope we learn from this. I think there is a lot to learn from, and we have to use this, and things like this, they shouldn't happen without taking the experience from it. It's the only thing I want to say and I can say.
I've known Ayrton Senna and had the genuine pleasure of interviewing Ayrton Senna ever since his early days in Formula Ford and Formula 3 back in the early 80s. And to my mind, he was one of the most talented, motivated, focused and lucid sportsmen that I've ever come across. Formula 1 this evening is mourning the loss of not one but 2 drivers, Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna.